The next question is, what does Paul state as a possible purpose for Onesimus leaving Philemon? And this is here in verse 15. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back for good, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. So the possible reason he states here is perhaps that he was being separated for a little while so that he could come back for good as a brother. The next question, how sure was he that this was the purpose? The first word in this translation in verse 15 is perhaps. He was not very sure. He says perhaps this is the reason. And the last question, what can this teach us about knowing God's will? This suggests something that's also stated in the book of Esther. You may be familiar with that great statement of Mordecai to Esther. Who knows if you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? The concept here is pretty significant. They're saying that there is a reason. There is a reason that Esther came into the kingdom. There is a reason that Philemon was separated, that Onesimus was separated from Philemon. There is a reason, and by implication here, there's a divine reason. There's some intention of God in bringing the circumstances to this state, bringing everything to pass so that Esther would be in the kingdom and so that Onesimus would be separated from Philemon. There is some purpose. But the second part is what's a little troubling to us and unsettling. The second part is that perhaps this is the reason. This suggests that yes, God has a purpose in this thing that is being done and has been done. But the second part suggests that we may not know what that purpose is with full certainty. Perhaps Paul is exercising his biblically guided, his spiritually enlightened mind and trying to ascertain what that purpose was. But he says with a degree of uncertainty, perhaps this is that purpose. Also, Mordecai also, who knows, it may be that this is why God has brought you into the kingdom. Saying again, God has a purpose. I think, according to my experience, according to my knowledge, according to my experience in the things of God and discerning God's will and seeing how God works, I think that this might be the reason. But this teaches us that also there are things in our life that are purposes of God. God has done something. God has allowed something, even if it's something bad. We know that all things work together for good, though they are not good themselves. Yes, it's true that God may have even allowed something negative for a purpose, but we must follow Paul, follow Mordecai, and not be too dogmatic as to what that purpose is. We may be able to say, perhaps this is the purpose. And even in that context, you see Paul urging Philemon to act in harmony with what he thinks that purpose is. But again, we ought to be careful not to be dogmatic, saying this I know for sure, this is the purpose of God, even if it seems very likely. And again, I believe Paul was as enlightened, if not more enlightened, than many of us. I know more than myself, he was enlightened and a spiritually led man. But he himself did not feel that he was in a position to say with 100% certainty that he knew what God's purpose was. So again, let's just use that as a guide, but not shying away from seeking to know, and not saying also that God doesn't have a purpose. He does have purposes in this world, and it is our Christian duty to seek out, to understand. This is what Paul says in Ephesians. He says, be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. It is our duty to seek and understand what the will of God is. But again, we ought to do that with the humility of a finite being trying to understand the infinite God.